This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Malink. Here's Steve.
Welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Bob Inglis, the Executive Director of RepublicIan.org, a growing group of conservatives who care about climate change. Bob, in part 1, we talked about why conservatives have often worked against the clean energy movement. But I want to know how you evolved. You served the people of South Carolina from 1993 to 1999, and again from 2005 to 2011. How did things change from a climate perspective between those two terms? You yourself were skeptical of climate change when you were in Congress in the 90s.
Yeah, for my first 6 years, I said climate change was nonsense. I fell into the trap you were describing earlier, just sort of a partisan identification. If Al Gore is for it, I'm against it. Next question is what So I admit that's quite ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. I had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. My son came to me that year. He's voting for the first time because he just turned 18 that year. And so he said to me, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." So his 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. New constituency was born, you know. These people can change the locks on the doors. And so that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 was going to Antarctica with a science committee and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. And then step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems improbable on a godless science committee trip, because we all know that all scientists are godless. Well, apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist was showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef and the challenge of coral bleaching. And I could tell that he and I shared a worldview. I could see that he was worshiping God in what he was showing me. And so later we had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes that he was making in his life to love God and love people. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning as much as possible in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place, and hangs family's clothes out in the line. So I wanted to be like my friend, who's now become a very dear friend, Scott Herron. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009, a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax. Note to self, not good timing. Great recession was on. Do not introduce carbon tax, even if it's revenue neutral and border adjustable, in the midst of the Great Recession, when you represent perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. It would not go well for you, and it didn't go well for me at all. I got 29% of the vote in the Republican runoff, and the other guy got the other 71% of the vote.
So, and that's an interesting kind of awakening you had there. I mean, I would imagine that kind of cultural clash is bigger than just what you experience between conservatives and their view that scientists are seen as godless deniers of faith, and that they're supporters of big government that want to regulate your life. How do we come to the table and, again, reconcile those perceptions?
Well, I think that it's something that's, as I was saying earlier, it's changing for young people of faith. They really don't see this contest between faith and science that, say, their grandparents experienced. So that's changing, but it would also help if scientists would be careful not to be as evangelistic as they are often about a godless evolution. You don't need to turn someone into an ardent believer in godless evolution in order to have them engage on climate. In fact, you can celebrate their faith and their belief in their role as stewards of the creation and the dignity that their creator gave them, even if you don't believe that as a scientist. But there are many scientists, like my friend Scott Herron, who most definitely do believe in that creator and the dignity that he gave us as co-creators and as stewards of the creation. But for the ones that don't believe that, don't sing all 17 verses of We Just Evolved and wait for people to come down front and subscribe to your view of godless evolution. There's no need to do that to people. You know what I'm referencing there is Billy Graham, at his crusades used to sing all 17 verses of Just As I Am or whatever, and the buses will wait, the buses will wait. Well, the most ardent proponents of godless evolution really are equally evangelistic about that proposition. And I remember being on the House Science Committee and a big controversy about how being a believer on that committee is like being asked by media outlets, what about your view on evolution? And it was really quite controversial for them. And I'm thinking, why did you need to sort of turn that into a big story like that? I do believe in a creator God. The good news is that young believers are changing on this topic. I think many scientists have just not understood, the ones that aren't like my friend Scott Heron, haven't realized the gratuitous offense that they're giving to people of faith by using the Carl Sagan line. Carl Sagan used to say on his show, the cosmos, it's all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. Well, that's a direct refutation of the words of the book of Revelation about Jesus being the Alpha and the Omega, the one who was and is to come. And I wonder if Carl Sagan knew that. Maybe he didn't know, and maybe it was just gratuitous offense that he didn't know he was giving to people like me who believe the opposite of what he was saying.
I think of Albert Einstein, who, I think is a bigger name than Carl Sagan, but I think he's made a number of very wise comments, his perceptions, that something to the effect that, the older he gets, the more he studies the universe, the more convinced he is that there's a God, that, faith is more important to him, not less. That's always resonated with me, that, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, ultimately came back to believing that there's greater powers at work than the cosmos.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Let me shift gears, I guess. Can you tell us about the organization you're leading? Tell us about its platform for change and its goals.
Yeah, so republician.org is conservatives reaching conservatives on climate change. We're a team of 6 who coordinate a community of about 10,000. We need another 0 on the end of that 10,000. And so we need people to join us at republician.org. It takes about 45 seconds. Name and email and zip code. And then that zip code is important to us because we want to be able to show conservative members of Congress that there are conservatives who care about climate change. Because once we make that constituency visible, then that member of Congress will know to lead that constituency, because I'm sure this isn't going to come as too big of a shock, but politicians generally follow, they don't lead. And so if you can show them a constituency that they might lead, they will in fact lead it. And so we want to show support for this idea that I'm a conservative and I care about climate change. And then in those cases where that member of Congress really is already caring, perhaps they've heard from their kids who plan to live on this planet longer than their parents, because they're younger, that they want to move, they want to engage on climate, but they need permission from their constituents. And so that this community that we're building is that source of permission.
Interesting. So, Bob, I'm aware of a similar type of group in the state of Ohio, conservative Republicans who want to promote a clean energy agenda. Are you aware of that group? And are there possibly other similar groups in other states, and that everyone's kind of doing their own thing independently, and that if they were all brought together, you might be able to add that 0 to your own group?
Yeah. It's such an interesting question. Yeah, and here we are on Forbes books. It's a relevant. It's a very relevant question. So, like, do you consolidate, or do you establish more and more data points? That's the approach that I think most people in the field are pursuing right now, rather than a consolidation of those various data points, just have a number of them so that people hear it in their particular sphere of influence and interest. That's the way it's been going. But I think the thing to keep in mind is there are really three ways to fix climate change. You can regulate it, you can incentivize it, or you can price it. And our view at republican.org is that the problem with the regulatory approach is you can't get China and India in on American regulations. The challenge of the incentivizing approach is you can use American tax code to incentivize behavior by American corporations. With the power sector having maybe only 10, 20,000 firms that produce electricity in the world, for example, not a very large market. So you wouldn't expect the price of the widget to come down very much. Unlike cell phones, 7 billion people, everybody would like to have one in their pocket. The widget price comes down. And so then that leaves you with a third, which is the one that we're so excited about, which is pricing mechanism that gets the whole world in on this.
And so that would be a price on carbon. That would be revenue neutral, presumably. In fact, I just read in the Wall Street Journal this morning that the Business Roundtable has shifted from resistance to not only accepting, but embracing a price on carbon to address climate change. So it's heartening to see that the business sector is starting to come around to this. To the degree that you said the government follows, doesn't lead, this is government's perfect chance to see the business sector leading and further supporting their efforts.
Oh, it's very exciting that the Business Roundtable has made this statement. It's really a key development. And who would have thought it? Here we are in the midst of a contentious presidential race. They could have ducked this for a while, but no, they came forward with some courage to say, yeah, this makes sense. Because, what I've often heard from manufacturers, I remember, for example, BMW, basically they tell me, don't attempt to regulate our efforts or our work. Just tell us what standards you want us to reach, and we'll figure out how to get there. So I remember BMW telling me one time, we have a fabulous BMW facility here in the 4th District of South Carolina, about $7 billion of German money on the ground in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And so they told me, now, please don't have South Carolina EPA, DHEC we call it, but don't have South Carolina EPA attempt to regulate us in how to paint a BMW, because we can assure you that we know better than anybody in the world how to paint a BMW. Just tell us how many parts per million we can emit, and then we will hit that. Because they like to say they're an engineering company that happens to make cars, and they make very fine cars, and they paint them very well. That's an example of how I think what the Business Roundtable is saying is, don't come in with some complicated set of regulations that lead to litigation and evasion. Just give us a clear price signal. Tell us the cost of dumping into the trash dump of the sky, just like there is a tipping fee at the city dump, and we will regulate ourselves. We will figure out how to live with that. It's the most efficient way. And the thing is, again, as I said earlier, I'm presenting this all in high-octane conservatism, but what I've just described there is exactly what Al Gore has been for about 30 years. And so the good news is, if we could just drop all the partisan wedges, we really could come together and have America lead the world to a solution on climate change. And it's reflected in the Business Roundtable's move here, the really important voice in this.
So, Bob, as a conservative who cares about the environment, would you vote for someone affiliated with the other party who strongly endorses climate action policies?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's not part of my day job, but I've joined the Republicans for Biden. So. And it has to do with climate action. We just don't have time to wait around on climate. We are seeing the whites of its eyes now, and we've got to take a shot. We don't have time to dither for another decade. You could say, well, here's another terrible situation. The economy's in the tank. The coronavirus stalks. Maybe it's going to be another decade of disastrous disputation like the one that commenced with the global financial crisis. But we at Republican.org think that it's not going to be that way for two reasons. One is we've had more experiences with climate change in the intervening years. The West is on fire, the hurricanes, the sea level rise. We've all experienced it more. And then the second is the political realities that I described earlier remain the same, which is that you can't win those suburban districts with a retro position on climate change. And so I don't expect Republicans who have a longer time horizon than Donald Trump to go into another decade of disastrous disputation. If you think about it, Donald Trump's timeline or her time horizon is simply between now and November the 3rd. The time horizon for Kevin McCarthy or for a U.S. Senator on the Republican side is 2022, 2024, 2026, years in which they hope to create a majority in the House and the Senate. And so in that time horizon, I think that there's a realization that the political realities are the same, that you can't win suburban districts. You can't win the majority without them. You can't win that situation with a retro position on climate.
So tell us about your future plans. Is it the book, another run for Congress? Have you considered running for the presidency?
Of the Sertoma Club, I think the idea is you join the Sertoma Club, you don't show up at the meeting, and then they elect you president. No, I don't have presidential hair. Apparently, that's not needed anymore, though. Anyway, so my ambition is to win this policy on climate and to have fellow conservatives rise to the occasion and say, we've got a solution. Yes, we do. We got a solution. How about you? That's what we need to say back to the left. And then what we're going to hear, thankfully, from the left is people like Al Gore and my friends at Citizen Climate Lobby, who are many of whom are progressives, calling back across the gymnasium, just like in middle school, Yes, we got a solution. Yes, we do. We got a solution. How about you? And then we're going to find out that it's the same solution, and it's the one that almost every economist in the world supports. And I know this is an age of overstatement, and that sounds like an overstatement, but it really isn't. Almost all economists in the world would agree that the first and most obvious thing to do is to just price in the negative effects of the burning of fossil fuels, internalize the negative externalities. I once asked a senior economist at Virginia Tech. Senior means that he's an older fellow. And so I said to him, give me the name of an economist that I should read who would disagree with that proposition. He sat back in his chair and he thought for a minute, and then he came with the answer. He said, can't think of one. He said, in fact, you can't be an economist if you disagree with that proposition. He said, it'd be like being a scientist and not believing in the scientific method. So he says, no, there isn't one. The amazing thing is, as much as the consensus exists in the scientific community as to the causes, the consensus among economists as to the solution is even greater than that. It's obvious, say, everybody from Paul Krugman to Greg Mankiw. Paul on the left, Greg on the right, they'd all say the same thing, is do that first. And now, of course, it may not be enough. We may find out that the price signal isn't strong enough in the transportation sector. If so, we might have to do other things, higher CAFE standards, for example. It may be that fugitive emissions of methane aren't controlled by this price signal. If so, then there may have to be a regulatory response there. But the first and most obvious thing to do is this, particularly, Steve, because if we get to the worldwide situation, that's the key, is he's got to make this worldwide. And one additional benefit, by the way, that I hope conservative listeners may be hearing here is that what we're talking about here is just a bold move by the United States. There's no bowing and scraping at the UN or protracted negotiations here. Well, by the way, we believe that we should not have withdrawn from Paris. That was a mistake, as I said earlier. But that established a will. What we're looking for now is a way. And this way would use the prize of access to the American market as the lever. So it's like this. America just acts and says, we're going to act on climate change. We're going to price in this negative effect in your goods coming from a country that doesn't have the same internalization. We're going to achieve that for you by imposing that tax. But oh, by the way, the tax is going to be remitted to Washington. That would make it in every trading partner's interest to do the same thing back home, so that when their goods come through an American port, they come through without that adjustment and without the collection of the American tax, because the tax already been paid at home. Mm-hmm. And so we think this is the way to get the whole world in, but no international agreement. And that's very attractive, we think, to fellow conservatives.
Wow. My last question to you was going to be, what gives you hope that humankind will eventually rise to the epic challenge of climate change? But I think you kind of just answered that the U.S. can lead by doing something very simple and practical, and the whole world will have to follow. I mean, that's a very hopeful scenario.
Yeah, it's just a sensible solution that makes it so that America is leading using the power of our marketplace, and access to that marketplace is the prize. But I would say to you too, I'm supremely confident that we are going to act on climate change. The question is whether we're going to act soon enough to avoid the worst of the consequences, and that's the open question. But it's going to become so obvious that we need to act, and the solutions can become obvious. And yes, it's hard, but when you have folks like the Business Roundtable coming forward, things start moving. It's so like in the global financial crisis, I remember somebody wrote that it's amazing how the impossible went to the inevitable without ever passing through the probable.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that's what's going to happen on climate and this pricing mechanism. What seems politically impossible, because who wants a new tax, for goodness sakes? Well, it's revenue neutral, so it's a very special kind of tax, and it's border adjustable, so you get the world in. But who wants a new tax? It's terrible politics. It seems impossible. But I really do believe it's going to go to the inevitable without ever passing through probable.
Wow. Bob, I've totally enjoyed our conversation. I've been personally enlightened, and I'm sure that many listeners will feel the same way. Thanks for educating us on the role conservatives can and should be taking on the critical issue of climate change.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
His name is Bob Inglis. He's the former U.S. Representative for South Carolina's 4th District, and he is now the Executive Director of RepublicEN.org, a group dedicated to addressing climate change through conservative policy initiatives.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Malink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.